This is a test of everything. Hoping my new microphone works. We've got little DJI helping us out. Today I want to talk to you about prologues. Controversial, I know. A silence of 3 parts. It was night again. The Waystone Inn lay in silence, and it was a silence of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a hollow, echoing quiet, made by things that were lacking. If there had been a wind, it would have sighed through the trees, set the inn's sign creaking on its hooks, brushed the silence down the road like trailing autumn leaves. If there had been a crowd, even a handful of men inside the inn, they would have filled the silence with conversation and laughter, the clatter and clamor one expects from a drinking house during the dark hours of night. If there had been music, but no, of course there was no music. In fact, there were none of these things, and so the silence remained. Inside the Waystone, a pair of men huddled at one corner of the bar. They drank with quiet determination, avoiding serious discussions of troubling news. In doing this, they added a small, sullen silence to the larger, hollow one. It made an alloy of sorts, a counterpoint. The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened for an hour, you might begin to feel it in the wooden floor underfoot and in the rough, splintering barrels behind the bar. It was in the weight of the black stone hearth that held the heat of a long-dead fire. It was in the slow back and forth of a white linen cloth rubbing along the grain of the bar. And it was in the hands of the man who stood there, polishing a stretch of mahogany that already gleamed in the lamplight. The man had true red hair, red as flame. His eyes were dark and distant, and he moved with the subtle certainty that comes from knowing many things. The Waystone was his, just as the third silence was his. This was appropriate, as it was the greatest silence of the 3, wrapping the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as autumn's ending. It was heavy as a great river, smooth stone. It was the patient, cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die. This is the prologue for Name of the Wind, one of the single best fantasy books that I have ever read. Why did I just read it to you for my second ever YouTube video? Because I want to talk to you about prologues, which are a very controversial thing, something that I'm very interested in. I just rewrote my own prologue last week after holding on to this first draft for months and months and months on end. So let's get into it. So about 2 weeks ago, I put out some polls on my Instagram asking this very simple question. Prologues, yes or no? 85% said yes, prologues, and 15% said no. Follow-up question to that was, best prologue length if you are prologue. 13% said that the chapter length is fine. My first draft of my first prologue was the length of a chapter. 53% said keep it short. Patrick Rothfuss in Name of the Wind, his prologue is 1 page. There's a lot packed in there. It was really short and brief, but very impactful. 5% still said no prologue, and 29% said it depends on the story. So if we're ranking it, most people want a prologue. And of those people who want the prologue, they either say keep it short or tailor it to your story. Let's Google this. Purpose of a prologue. A prologue is a separate introductory section of a literary work that comes before the main narrative. It sets the stage for the story or provides background information about the character, setting, or events. There are a couple things that I would take into account when I'm considering whether or not I'm going to put a prologue into my book. The first one is, does it take place significantly far in the past or significantly far in the future? And it's otherwise pretty disconnected from where you're starting your story at chapter 1. You could probably include it, especially if it gives critical context to your story. Otherwise, if it starts right before your main character in chapter 1, if it includes your main character in chapter 1, I have a hard time justifying why that should be a prologue instead of just a scene earlier in your story. The prologue should be set enough apart from the rest of the book that it has significance, but it doesn't really have a spot anywhere else, and is information that the reader needs to know right away. Another thing that I would think about is there's going to be exceptions to every rule, but generally it's not a good idea to have a prologue that's heavy on info dumping, heavy on world building. You want to include those and give the reader crucial information early on so that they can get some understanding, but you do not want to overwhelm them. My book is written in first person, single POV, first person single POV. It's just me and Kona hanging out in Kona's head the entire book. And it's a YA fantasy, and I know people are going to have a lot of opinions about even just that decision. I'm using my prologue to give the reader a little bit more information and set the scene in a way that Kona, my first person single POV character, does not understand. For the rest of the book, you are relying on Kona's dreams, Kona's thoughts, Kona's actions and reactions to tell you the story and to help you kind of flesh out your understanding of this world. It's particularly tricky with characters that have grown up in isolation like mine has. How in the world do you help her to navigate and learn a complex magic system, understand what the rest of the world looks like if she's never left her hometown? In an age, in a world where the internet does not exist, we are often burdened by the curse of knowledge, where we understand so much that we assume our characters are going to know more than they do. The prologue is a perfect tool for giving your readers not too much, but just a little bit of context and background information and introduction to the rest of your story, a perspective that's a little bit more in depth and more background understanding than even your character will have. And I think that that's one of the primary reasons that I chose to keep a prologue, but I did choose to rewrite it. Originally, the prologue read as another POV, looking at one of the big baddies and what was going on over in their fortress, but it was too much detail. It was too many characters. It was literally like a high lord and his council, and all of them were talking about their people. There's 10 different kinds of people in my world. It was so much info dumping. Some of the things that I was hinting at, they were way too easy to guess because I went into too much detail. I gave it away too early. And I was like, okay, now I've got this 5-page long prologue that's got all of these characters that you're not going to see again until like the end of the book. Just all of this stuff that honestly, it's going to get swept to the back of the mind. You know, all those details were going to get swept to the back of my readers' minds. And that's not what I wanted. That's not what I wanted. I shelved that prologue, okay? Took inspiration from Patrick Rothfuss, and I wrote my own 1-page prologue. And it works so much better for my story. I ended up writing that and sending it out with my manuscript to my alpha readers the next day. And I've gotten so many people postulating, theorizing just on the prologue. It introduced the world. It set up some expectations for all of the peoples that they're going to interact with, some of the black sand beaches and the forests that you'll see inspired by like Icelandic landscapes, as well as some of like the spooky fairy tale vibes, but it's very short. And it ends with a landmark event that will reoccur at some point in the plot, and it will help timestamp the prologue. A couple of things that I use to help make my prologue really effective. And yeah, I'm getting a lot of really positive feedback from my alpha readers now. So anyway, those are a couple of my thoughts just surrounding prologues. In the literary world, there is a constant battle between the prescriptive and descriptive viewpoints. Prescriptive being that there's one way to do things, there's a set of rules, and if you break them, that's incorrect. And descriptive being this is how language works right now. This is what's trending. This is how our language is evolving. Those two kinds of conversations and approaches are constantly at war. So I'm not saying you should definitely have a prologue because some stories don't need it. I'm not saying you should not have a prologue because readers love prologues. It depends on the story. But in general, make sure that your scene is separate and distinct enough from your story that it doesn't feel like another chapter. Because then why not just make it a chapter? Make sure that it's distinct and separate enough that it really is just a prologue. The second thing, do not stuff it full of just world building and info dumping. We need some sort of a character introduction. We need eyes to see the story through. And if you don't give us those eyes, we're going to be very confused as readers. Third thing, if you include like a little landmark event in your prologue, like a natural disaster, even a date, that will help kind of orient your readers, because then when you step back in time or step forward in time, readers kind of understand when the prologue happened and how it relates to the story. I also posted this question to my threads. 35% said, yes, definitely have a prologue. 19% said no prologue, and 46% said it depends and left comments. Books by Zoe Blessington said, I think it depends on the story and if a future scene will generate some initial interest and tease part of the plot without giving too much away about where the story is going. I really liked this one as well by Len Fisher. He says, I like prologues, but I know some people don't, so I always keep it optional. I use them to describe the event that sets up the main story, some backstory for the readers that want it. Honestly, I don't really understand people preferring to skip content, but I've accepted it. I was really surprised to learn that some people actually skip the prologue altogether, as well as the epilogue. I always look at the map. I always look at the pronunciation guide. I always look at the table of contents. Everything you put into the book, at least know that if I'm reading your book, I am looking at all of the content that you put in there. This user says, sometimes the story simply aches for one, and sometimes it's unnecessary. Sometimes the prologue might even tell too much. It depends. Rachel C. Wrights said, I think a prologue works best in the books following the first in a series, personally. I also thought that this was a really good point. If you're writing the first in a series and you want to jump right into the action, that is always a good, safe way to go, especially to generate interest and hook new readers to your book for the first time. When you go on to the second or third books of your series, if you were to use your prologue as kind of like a recap of what happened, or to bring them up to speed, or like set a new scene if you're moving to a new part of your world, a new relationship, a new character, that is a great way to introduce that and kind of help ease your readers into the next book. If it's been a while since it's been published, that would be especially helpful in my mind. Really interesting discussion on prologues today. I think for some reason, it's so controversial. A lot of people messaged me privately saying that they were so surprised with how controversial the prologue is. And I really think that the controversy comes down to whether you're approaching it as a prescriptivist, saying that there is a right and wrong, hard and fast rule with books, or if you're approaching it as a descriptivist, which I think are definitely the people saying that it depends on your story. A lot of hot takes, I guess, just on prologues. I personally love prologues, and if you've put in the effort to put a prologue in your book and a map and a pronunciation guide, a table of contents, whatever content you put in your book, I'm going to be reading that. I read the author's note, I read the acknowledgements, I read all of that. Not every reader does, and that's okay. We are all allowed to have our own reading preferences, but it's definitely something to think about, especially if you're considering whether or not to put a prologue in your own story. If you do, keep it short, keep it focused, and make sure that it's distinct and separate from the rest of your story, from your other chapters. I hope this was as interesting of a discussion for you as it was for me. I really enjoyed talking to the bookish community about topics like this. If you don't yet, you should follow me on Instagram and Threads, author.h.ackerman. Participate in the polls that I share on my story. Maybe I'll mention you in your response when I share these videos, because I just think it's very interesting, and I think that statistics are important, and I'm really grateful for everybody who contributed. It was a really, really interesting discussion. If you liked this video and you want to see more, please like and subscribe and share it with all of your writing friends. And happy writing, happy reading. Please feel free to wander by again. We'll see you in the next one.